We've got William Creighton from Victoria University of Wellington, and he's going to talk about queer ecology. And the presentation follows the development of an interactive installation through a queer approach to spatial design. And hopefully some people have seen your installation out in the foyer and have come and had a chat to you, and we'll listen to more of what you get to say now. Thanks. Cheers.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm William. I'm currently studying at Victoria University. I'm 2 months into my thesis towards a Master of Architecture. I've lived in Wellington for the past 4 or so years, and I've also spent some time studying in Copenhagen as part of my coursework. That was unfortunately during the time of COVID in 2020, but the kind of course focused on political architecture and critical sustainability. A little bit about me to give some context to some of the points I'll be discussing. I'm cisgendered, I identify as male, and I am gay, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. My background, interestingly enough, is not in landscape architecture. However, my areas of interest encompass body politics and queer spatial occupation, which I believe can be applied across all areas of the design profession. I think before I want to kind of dive into everything, I would like to thank a few people. Firstly, for the university and my supervisor for their support, both in the research and me being here. Next, I would like to thank my sponsors for the installation. They helped with the material costs, so Plymasters and Steel and Tube. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Mark and Hannah, who approached me about being part of this conference, even though I kind of am a bit of an alien to the landscape industry. But finally, I want to recognise my privilege as well, a privilege to stand here in front of you all talking about a complex, kind of multifaceted topic like this. I want to recognise that being cisgendered, being male, being educated, being able-bodied, and being supported by friends and family are many of the predominant reasons why I'm able to be here today. I just thought I'd start with kind of a definition of what queer is, because I think even myself, sometimes I struggle with kind of grasping that. So queer as a term has generally remained undefined. However, the importance of critical engagement with queer spatial design has remained. This importance, nonetheless, stems from the constant presence of queer bodies in our space. And this quote kind of explains the generally assumed that queer is anything that goes against the binary tendencies of gender, sex, sexuality, and sexual activity. I want to first start by outlining some of the key discussion points my research has interplayed over the past couple of months, beginning with design politics and the role of our industry in the formation of space. Secondly, I want to discuss the body as a site and its implications into a range of spatial outcomes and orientations. Next, I'll explain a bit about the process and results of the installation that's in the foyer and my reflections on this. And lastly, I'll touch on where I'm headed with my thesis moving into the larger scales. First I kind of want to talk about spatial design practices and more specifically touching on some of the work from past Firth conferences and my fellow speakers as well around placemaking and placemakers. We live in a rich, complex social fabric constructed from each individual's intersectionality. From gender identity to sexuality, race, ability, education or culture, we all sit on a series of these blurred lines. However, traditional architectural practices have historically stabilised themselves through binaryistic thinking. This thinking gives hierarchical value to one opposition over the other, so heterosexual over homosexual, masculine over feminine, cisgender over trans and non-binary gender identities. With this, we can kind of ask ourselves, as professionals, who are we designing for? Who are we allowing into our spaces and who are we not? This kind of placemaking process gives status, it gives rise to dictation over the spaces and places everyone must occupy, and thus kind of quite a large responsibility. As these placemakers, we must comprehensively understand how we serve others in our process of space making and how they're able to be formed around the tendencies and behavioural norms of each intersectionality. As an industry, we also must understand that these spaces we design are also the spaces we occupy. No greater example of this is the workplace environment. A survey conducted by the New Zealand Workplace shows that even in metropolitan employment settings, 20% of participants that surveyed did not have faith in their employers to address LGBTQIA issues at the workplace. Unfortunately, this data doubles when you look at rural employment environments. So yeah, it's quite alarming. But they speak to, I think, most interestingly enough, one of the safest spaces for queer people. You know, hopefully, who your work colleagues are. So if this is a quote-unquote safe space, then what's it like elsewhere? Expanding on this, what is arguably one of the most queer spaces. This is kind of my bread and butter of Wellington, Cuba Street. We can see that work is still needed to facilitate the bodies of queer people in these sorts of spaces. At the end of 2018, and I might get a little bit emotional, but I was walking home from university down Cuba Street in the early evening when I bumped into two of my friends. At the time I had bleach blonde hair, like the first image. I think it might have actually possibly been pink. And when they both were arguably dressed as what a lot of people would say is queer. Although if you look at things like Judith Butler's theory, you would argue that their attire is not actually queer, but it's a stylized repetition of acts through time, which people commonly misunderstand as queer gender expression. I digress. We said hello and to one another, and we began to walk our separate ways, just to be rudely interrupted by an intoxicated patron who had clearly been escorted from the adjoining restaurant. They looked directly at me and said the following, and I apologise for my crudeness in the statement, but "You effing faggots are the reason there's a problem with this country." While this clearly threw me for a loop, frightening me into holding myself a little tighter on the remainder of my journey. However, what was most shocking was their complete confidence in saying such a statement on an arguably passive evening for Cuba Street. Now, this is probably my young naivety at play. It speaks to a larger issue, one that explains why even our most queer-friendly spaces are still not good enough. We must ask ourselves, in what way do our heteronormative frameworks that we design within continue to facilitate this bigoted behaviour? Reflecting on this experience, I also understand that if I was more expressive of my queerness, more feminine, or smaller in size, I may well have had a worse outcome to the scenario. However, this once again highlights the need to further our design methods of intersectionality. So the question remains, what is our role in mitigating these sorts of things? Some of the theory I've been talking about has included the likes of William White's work, in which he expresses people's ability to vote with their feet, a process which is democratic, explanatory, and political. They use spaces which are easy to use and comfortable. So how can we design for the comfort, and more specifically, the comfort of queer bodies and our urban and landscape fabrics? So moving into my actual work for my thesis, I'm following the likes of Jane Rendell, who utilise a design-led research methodology, so it's very experimental, so it might be a little bit speculative, but we'll see. And so some of the same question is applied to 3 scales. The first scale I've been working through is an installation, or a kind of mediation device, and looking at the body as a site for that process. I'm also looking at how the installation targets the body, and how we can queer spatial binaries through the lens of this device. Before showing you the results, I thought it'd be best to briefly cover some of the concept work behind the model. The speculative device tackles methods of orientation and disorientation, specifically approaching the ephemeral qualities associated with body-to-body engagements, opening the conversation to critiquing our binary understanding of up and down, front and back, and left and right. From that, understanding the focus of disorientation also intertwines through the user's sensory experience with the device, building on queer phenomenology, so sight, touch, smell. From this understanding of how orientation can parallel to queer radicalism, and the fact that it's both often met with sharp conservatism. This once again hopefully speaks to the dictation of the other in opposition to oneself. To draw back to some real examples. Some real examples of disorientation, public space occupation performed by homeless populations, people with disabilities, gender and sexual minorities can be assessed. Here we see the dictation of displaced French citizens, where they're confined to a car park on the back of a train line. In doing so, it crudely removes these undesirables from the rest of the city with an out of sight, out of mind attitude. And you can also see the name of it is A Camp 47, and I think as some sort of twisted joke they've made it look like a gun. Furthermore, we see Judith Butler and Surinara Taylor discuss how life in a wheelchair means disability as a social status, something that's put on you rather than something that you have, determined by the access one has to an urban amenity, and thus how others respond to Taylor's body. She states that the solution to democratizing space is the exposure we have to the other or different bodies. We can extend the same thinking into space ownership with gender and sexuality, like the dreaded manspreading, which has become such an issue that the MTA in New York has actually created a campaign. Oh, can we go back a slide? We missed the good meme. There we go. Dude, stop the spread. It's a space issue. So this relative closeness to other people in space, defined as proxemics, can intertwine with our intersectionality. I think that's kind of where my research sits. Those defining characteristics we use to determine our comfort level towards other people in space. So now moving into the actual physical model, which you've probably seen by now. I've approached the model itself by working through challenging the relative and perceived proxemics. As a result, a sensorial sort of folly was created. It's kind of pointless. There doesn't really seem to be much of a purpose. However, when experienced with another person, hopefully it allows the discovery and return to an oriented understanding of their presence near you. So please do give it a try. I can sit on the other side if you're nervous and I'll run you through it. So here are some of the workings of the screen, because sometimes it can be quite confusing. This is my friend Chris. Thanks, Chris. It's probably a good hint as to how you can work one of the screens as well. And then I kind of montaged a photo of how I felt using the device for the first time after quite an extensive building process in a very hyper-masculine workshop space. So where to next for this research? Scaling up, the domestic scale will apply some of the learning outcomes from this model, but also build on the relationship between body, architectural form, public space and landscapes. More specifically, tackling the process in which architectural design outcomes conform from spatial tendencies rather than the other way around, which is generally how we individualize our built context. And here's a really good example I've recently looked at is Michigan State University, where even though the architecture was the first component, they allowed the students and the staff to use the landscape spaces to determine the desire lines, and then they constructed that afterwards, which I thought was really great. Expanding from the installation work and having a fairly non-prescribed design method, I'm wanting to push this sort of process into the following scales. So by creating a queer framework in which individualised architectural outcomes are tertiary to the human-centric spatial formations. I would love to discuss this with you guys. This landscape's not, again, my expertise, but it's actually been great listening to you. We'll talk about it. And kind of a more cross-disciplinary lens possibly for the upcoming work. And thank you all once again for giving me as a queer person this platform to talk about queer existence and some body politic stuff. So thank you so much.